coach had been 2 days late. That alone told Abigail everything she needed to know about Silver Creek, Wyoming, a town that couldn't keep a schedule, couldn't fix a road, and from the looks of it, couldn't be bothered to try. She'd sat wedged between a traveling salesman who smelled of camphor and a woman with a birdcage on her lap for the better part of 40 hours, watching the landscape shift from scrubby flatlands to something harder, higher, and colder than anything she'd known back in Ohio. She hadn't slept. She hadn't eaten a proper meal since the last relay station 200 miles back. Her boots pinched. Her back ached from sitting upright. And somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the dust that had worked its way into every fold of her traveling dress, there was something else, a fear she'd been carrying so long it had stopped feeling like fear and started feeling like weather. Just a permanent condition, just the way the air tasted now. But she'd made a decision. And Abigail Harper, for all her faults and all the things the world had spent 28 years telling her about herself, was not a woman who unmade her decisions. The stagecoach lurched to a stop. "Silver Creek," the driver called down. "End of the line, folks. Everybody out." She was the last one off. That was partly because the salesman and the woman with the birdcage had pushed past her without a word, and partly because she needed a moment. Just one moment to press her hands flat against her thighs, breathe in through her nose, and remind herself who she was and why she'd come. Abigail Harper, 28 years old, widow, smart enough to know when she was in danger, brave enough to run toward the danger instead of waiting for it to catch her in the dark. She climbed down. Silver Creek was exactly what it sounded like. Silver only in name, a creek dried up to nothing in the summer heat, and a town built around both of those disappointments. A single main street, a general store, a saloon with a broken shutter banging slow and rhythmic in the wind, a blacksmith, a land office, a church that looked like it was losing an argument with gravity, and people, maybe 30 of them going about the ordinary business of a Tuesday afternoon. Except now they weren't. Now they were looking at her. She'd learned to read those looks a long time ago. There was a whole vocabulary in them. Surprise assessment, the quick calculation that people made when they saw a woman her size stepping off a stagecoach in a town like this. Some faces just went neutral, the polite blankness of people who'd been raised well enough not to say what they thought. Others didn't bother. She picked up her bag, set her shoulders, started walking toward the post office where she'd been told to ask for a Mr. Ethan Walker. She'd made it maybe 20 feet when she heard the voice behind her. "Well, I'll be damned." She didn't turn around. "Look at the size of that woman." She kept walking. Hey, I'm talking to you." Boots on the boardwalk, heavy and uneven, the gait of a man who'd started drinking before noon. "Hey, where you headed, sweetheart? The stagecoach is back that way if you need more room." Laughter, a handful of it. Not everyone, not most people she'd give Silver Creek that much, but enough. Enough to carry. Abigail stopped. She didn't stop because she was scared. She stopped because something in her had been very, very tired for a very long time, and that tiredness had reached some kind of limit without her noticing the way a pot reaches a boil quietly. And then all at once, it's over the rim. She turned around slowly. The man was maybe 30, ranch hand build, red in the face from sun and whiskey both. He had a letter in his hand folded dirty at the edges, looked like it had been passed around. He was grinning at his friends, 3 other men lounging against the post outside the saloon enjoying the show. Abigail looked at the letter. She recognized it. It was the advertisement. The mail-order advertisement that had been placed in the Ohio Gazette and 3 other papers, the one she'd answered 8 weeks ago. She didn't know how he'd gotten a copy. It didn't matter. "That's mine," she said. The man looked at her, looked at his friends, looked back at her. "What's that? That letter?" She walked back toward him. "That's my correspondence. Hand it over." He held it up out of reach, which was stupid, because she was only 2 inches shorter than him and broader through the shoulders. "Don't think so," he said. "It's real entertaining reading. You know what it says in here?" He raised his voice, addressing the growing audience. "Says a widow woman from Ohio, educated, experienced in household management, is seeking a husband in the Wyoming territory." He grinned. "Don't say nothing about how much woman we'd be getting." More laughter. Louder this time. Abigail looked at him for a long moment. She looked at his friends. She looked at the people who'd stopped to watch women in front of the general store, a man outside the land office, a boy of maybe 12, sitting on a fence post eating an apple, with his full attention now directed at the scene in front of him. Then she reached out and took the letter from the man's hand. Fast before he registered what was happening. Just plucked it clean out of his fingers. He blinked. "Hey, you're Clem Dobbins," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd heard the name at the last relay station from the driver who'd given her a sketch description of Silver Creek's more notable residents as a kind of public service. "You work for the Henderson Ranch. You owe wages at the saloon and at least 2 tabs at the general store. Your horse has a loose shoe on the left foreleg that you haven't had fixed in 3 weeks. She glanced at the horse tied at the post nearby. Make that 4 weeks by the look of it. Dobbins's grin had gone somewhere complicated. "I don't know what they told you about where you come from," Abigail said. "But where I come from, a man who needs an audience to feel big isn't a man worth much time." She held the letter up. "And a man who picks up someone else's mail and reads it out loud for laughs." She let the letter drop against his chest, deliberate and final. "He's not worth any time at all." Dead quiet on that boardwalk. The kind of quiet that has weight. Dobbins' face had gone past red into something purplish and ugly. "You don't know who you're talking to," he said low and mean. "This ain't Ohio. Out here a woman like you." "A woman like me what?" Abigail said. "Finish it." He didn't. She waited 3 full seconds looking at him. Then she picked up her bag, straightened her coat, and turned back toward the post office. "Have a good afternoon, Mr. Dobbins," she said without looking back. "Get that shoe fixed." The quiet held another moment. Then she heard something she hadn't expected. Not more laughter, not commentary, but a single slow exhale from somewhere to her right, the sound a person makes when they've been holding their breath. She didn't look to see who it was. She made it to the post office, went inside, and stood for a moment with her back against the closed door. Her heart going about twice its normal speed, and her hands shaking so hard she had to press them together to make them stop. The postmaster, an older man with wire spectacles, looked up from behind the counter and had the good sense not to say a word. "I'm looking for Ethan Walker," Abigail said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "He should have been notified I was arriving today." The postmaster looked at her for a moment. Then he looked out the window at the boardwalk at Dobbins, still standing there with his friends, and then at something further down the street, something Abigail had her back to and couldn't see. "Miss Harper," the postmaster said carefully, "I believe Mr. Walker is already here." She turned. Through the dusty glass of the post office window, across the width of the main street, she saw him. He was standing against the wall of the feed store, opposite arms, crossed, one boot flat against the wall behind him. Tall, very tall, with the kind of build that came from years of physical work at altitude, the kind that didn't have an ounce of anything extra to it. Dark hat pulled low. Dark eyes. A face that gave away nothing whatsoever. He'd been there the whole time. He'd watched all of it. Abigail felt something she hadn't anticipated, a rush of something that wasn't quite embarrassment and wasn't quite relief. She'd been performing for strangers, doing the thing she always did when cornered, and somehow it hadn't occurred to her that the man she'd traveled 1,500 miles to marry might be standing there watching her do it. She straightened, lifted her chin. He didn't move for a long moment. Then slowly, he pushed off from the wall and walked across the street toward the post office. Unhurried and quiet, with the even pace of a man who had never in his life needed to hurry, because he always knew exactly where he was going. He came through the door, took off his hat. Up close he was harder to read than he'd been at a distance, which was saying something. Late 30s, a jaw like something cut from the same rock as the mountains behind the town. Eyes that were dark brown, not black, though the difference was subtle. She only noticed because she was looking for something in them. Some clue to the man, and what she found was an attention that was very still and very complete. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he is genuinely trying to understand, not the way a man looks at a woman he is disappointed by. She hadn't let herself think about that possibility. She thought about it now. "Abigail Harper," she said, and put out her hand. He looked at it for a half-second, not dismissively, just like the gesture had caught him slightly off guard, like women in his life hadn't generally led with handshakes. Then he took it. His grip was careful, the way a man with very strong hands learns to be careful. "Ethan Walker," he said. His voice was low. Not soft low, the way a foundation is low. Something you feel more than hear. "You had a long ride. 2 days. You eat?" "Not since yesterday morning." He put his hat back on. "There's a place 2 streets over does a decent meal." He glanced toward the window where Dobbins and his companions were still visible on the boardwalk. Something moved in his expression. Not anger exactly, more like a settling, the way a man sets his weight before lifting something heavy. "We can talk about the ranch, what to expect. I'll answer what questions you have." "I have several," Abigail said. "I figured," he said. Something in his voice suggested this was not a complaint. "Come on then." He held the door. She walked through it. On the boardwalk, Dobbins was still there. He saw them come out together, and his expression shifted into something smirking and significant, like a man who's filed information away for later use. He started to say something. Ethan Walker looked at him. Just looked at him. Nothing else. Didn't slow down, didn't change his expression, didn't say a word. Dobbins closed his mouth. They walked. The eating place was a narrow room attached to the back of the general store, 4 tables, and a woman named Ruth, who brought coffee without being asked and didn't comment on anything, which Abigail appreciated more than she could say. They sat across from each other, and for a moment neither spoke, and the silence had a texture, not uncomfortable, just honest. The silence of 2 people who know they are strangers and have decided not to pretend otherwise. "The advertisement said you needed someone for household management," Abigail said. "Cooking, preserving, tending livestock." "That's right?" "It didn't say much about the location." "No," he agreed. "It didn't." "How far up?" 4 hours by horse from here, 6 in bad weather, closer to 7 if the upper trail's flooded." He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "It's remote. I won't lie to you about that. The nearest neighbor is 2 miles. Town is what you saw, not much. Winters are serious." "I grew up in rural Ohio," she said. "I've seen serious winters." "Not like Wyoming winters." "No," she said. "I expect not." She looked at him steadily. "You're telling me the difficult parts first." Seemed like the honest approach. "I appreciate that." She set down her own cup. "I'll do the same then. I'm not a small woman. I know what people here think of that. I got a demonstration 20 minutes ago. I won't pretend I didn't notice the way people looked when I stepped off that stage. I know what you were expecting, and I know I'm not it." Something moved in his expression. Not pity, she would have recognized pity, had spent years learning to recognize it and refuse it. This was something else. Something more like consideration. "What I was expecting," he said slowly, "and what I saw out there on that boardwalk are 2 different things." She waited. "The woman I was expecting," he said, "would have kept walking and cried about it later. Maybe left on the next stage." He looked at her directly. "That's not what I saw." Abigail held his gaze. "No," she said, "it isn't." A long pause. "My late husband's name was Thomas Harper," she said. "He died 14 months ago. Pneumonia." She kept her voice even. "He was a good man. He built a small shipping company in Columbus, nothing grand but honest. After he died, a man named Victor Langford moved to acquire the company. He said Thomas had borrowed money from him. He had papers. But Thomas never borrowed from Victor Langford. I know that because I kept Thomas's books. I was his bookkeeper for 6 years, he taught me himself." She met Ethan's eyes. "The papers were false. Victor had the judges. He had the lawyers. He had everything but the truth, and he knew I had the truth, and so he decided the simplest solution was to have me declared incompetent to manage my own affairs and placed under guardianship." She paused. "His guardianship." Ethan was very still. "I left before he could file," she said. "I took copies of everything. Ledgers, letters, receipts, everything I could carry. I've been moving since March. I answered your advertisement in May." She kept her voice very calm, very level. I'm telling you this because you deserve to know what you're marrying. Victor Langford has resources. He may eventually find out where I've gone. I don't believe he will pursue me this far into the territories. I don't think he considers me worth that trouble. But I won't deceive you. You should know. The silence after this was different. She watched Ethan's face and found she couldn't fully read it, which was unusual for her. She was generally good at reading people. He was looking at the table, not at her, and there was something working behind his eyes that he wasn't sharing yet. Langford, he said finally. Victor Langford out of Columbus, Ohio. Yes, you know the name. Heard it, he said. Man who runs the Territory Land Office in Cheyenne had dealings with someone by that name a few years back. Something about mineral rights. He looked up. Nothing came of it up here, but the name was mentioned. Something cold moved through Abigail's chest. Mr. Walker. Ethan. Ethan. She pressed her hands flat on the table. If there's any chance he has connections in Wyoming territory, then we deal with it, he said simply. No drama in the words, no bravado, just the flat, certain tone of a man stating a fact about the weather. You came a long way. You told me the truth. I told you the ranch is remote and the winters are serious. He stood dropping coins on the table for Ruth. We've got 4 hours of daylight left. If we're going up the mountain today, we should start. Abigail looked up at him. That's it? What else is there? She thought about that. She thought about all the conversations she'd rehearsed on the stagecoach, all the explanations and justifications and apologies she'd prepared for the possibility that the truth would make him reconsider, send her back on the next stage, leave her standing alone again in a town that had already made its opinion of her very clear. She stood, picked up her bag. I'll need a horse, she said. I can ride, but I haven't in some time. Something steady. I brought a steady one, he said. Her name is Clara. She's patient. He moved toward the door, then paused without turning around. You'll want your coat. Temperature drops fast once we start climbing. Outside, she could still see Dobbins and his friends down the street, watching them load her bag onto the pack horse, with the idle, assured cruelty of men who fully expected to still be here, still be watching when she came back down the mountain in defeat. She didn't look at them. She pulled on her coat, checked the buttons, and accepted Ethan Walker's brief and matter-of-fact assistance mounting Clara without comment and without ceremony, because that was apparently how things were done on this mountain, practically honestly without fuss. Clara was steady. She was right about that. They rode out of Silver Creek with the afternoon sun, throwing long shadows west, and the mountain rising ahead of them, enormous and indifferent and cold at the peaks even in August. Abigail did not look back at the town. She kept her eyes on the trail on the way it narrowed and began to climb on the broad back of Ethan Walker, riding ahead of her in silence. From behind her, she heard Dobbins call out something. His friends laughed. She kept riding. The trail curved. The town disappeared behind a stand of pine. The mountain closed around them like a door. The first week on Ethan Walker's mountain nearly broke her. Not the work itself, though. The work was brutal in ways Abigail hadn't fully prepared for, not even after all the honest warnings he'd given her over coffee in Silver Creek. It was the accumulation of it. The relentlessness. The way the mountain didn't pause to let you catch your breath, didn't offer a kind word when you failed, didn't care one way or another, whether you kept going or sat down in the dirt and wept. She burned the first 3 meals. Not slightly, catastrophically. The wood stove in Ethan's cabin ran hotter than anything she'd cooked on before, and the altitude changed everything. Timing temperature, the way bread rose, the way water boiled. The first morning she'd produced something that might charitably be called porridge, and watched Ethan eat it without a single change in expression, which she found both comforting and maddening in equal measure. It's terrible, she said flatly. It's food, he said. That's not the same thing. No, he agreed. But it'll do for now. She dumped the pot and started again. The water situation was worse. The creek that fed the cabin ran about 200 yards downhill from the back door, and twice a day she was supposed to carry 2 full buckets up the slope. The first time she tried it, she made it maybe 50 feet before her footing went wrong on the loose shale, and she went down hard on one knee, both buckets hitting the ground and rolling water soaking into the earth and gone. She sat there for a moment, knee-throbbing hands scraped raw looking at the empty buckets. She heard Ethan's boots on the path behind her. "Don't," she said before he could speak. A pause. "Don't what? Don't help me up. Don't tell me it happens to everyone. Don't." She stopped, got to her feet herself, picked up both buckets, and started back down the slope toward the creek. "Just don't." I didn't. He stood where he was and let her go, and when she came back up the second time with both buckets full and her jaw set so hard it ached, he was gone back to whatever he'd been doing in the barn, leaving her to make it to the cabin door on her own terms. She found out later he'd been watching from the barn window the whole time. Not to judge, not to wait for her to fail. She found that out 3 weeks later when he mentioned it in passing. The way he mentioned most things obliquely without ceremony, as if stating a simple fact about geography. "I watched you that second trip," he said one evening, not looking up from the harness he was mending. "You adjusted your grip between the creek and the halfway mark. Different angle, better weight distribution." She looked at him. "You noticed that." "I notice most things," he said. "You problem-solved it on your own. Didn't ask, didn't wait. Just figured it out." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. But something shifted in her chest. Something small and careful, like a door opening a crack in a room that had been shut a long time. The days built on each other in ways she hadn't expected. She failed at the water hauling, and then she got better at it. She burned the bread, and then she learned the stove's particular temper. The way the left side ran 5 degrees hotter, the way you had to set the damper just so on windy mornings. She dropped an entire sack of grain trying to lift it from the feed room floor and spent 20 minutes redistributing it into smaller loads, and by the end of the second week, she could move the full sacks without dropping them. She fell off Clara twice. Once badly enough that Ethan heard it from the barn and came at a run, which was the first time she'd seen him move fast, and the look on his face when he found her sitting up in the dirt, checking her own wrist for damage was something she filed away without examining too closely. "I'm fine," she said. "Let me see." He crouched beside her, took her wrist carefully in both hands, and ran his thumb along the bone with a focus and gentleness that seemed entirely at odds with the rest of his manner, not out of character exactly, just a side of him she hadn't seen before. "I said I'm fine." "I heard you." He didn't stop. "Flex your fingers." She flexed them. Nothing ground or snapped. He set her hand down, stood, and offered her his arm to get up, which she took because her knee was already complaining, and her pride had limits she was learning to respect. "The saddle slipped," she said. "I need to check the cinch tighter before I mount." "Yes," he said. "You're not going to tell me to be more careful." "You already know to be more careful," he said. "What's the point of saying it?" That was Ethan Walker she was learning. A man who didn't waste words on what was already understood. A man who showed things instead of saying them, showed up with an extra blanket left folded at the foot of her bed after she'd mentioned the cold. Showed up at the creek one morning with a length of rope already rigged to help stabilize the bucket yoke. Showed up in the kitchen doorway one evening when she was attempting her 4th bread attempt and said only, "Damper's too far open," then walked away before she could thank him. She thought about that a lot in those first weeks. The way he communicated sparse practical entirely without performance. She'd lived most of her life around men who used words to manage her, to contain her, to tell her what she was and wasn't. Thomas had been different. Thomas had been good, but even Thomas had occasionally spoken over her in rooms full of men who expected it. Ethan Walker looked her in the eyes when she spoke and waited until she was finished. Every time. Without fail. It was she realized one of the more extraordinary things about him. And she wasn't sure he knew he was doing it. By the end of the 3rd week, something had changed in the cabin. Not dramatically, not all at once, but perceptibly, the way a season changes. She'd rearranged the kitchen. Not for herself, or not entirely for herself, but because the layout had been inefficient tools, stored nowhere near where they were used, staples kept in a corner that got no light. She'd moved things. Labeled some, made a list of what was low in the stores, and set it on the table without comment. Ethan had picked up the list, read it, and ridden down to Silver Creek the next morning without saying a word. He came back with everything on it. She made a proper dinner that night. Not fancy stew and bread that actually rose and held together, but warm and seasoned and timed correctly. And when he sat down at the table and took the first bite, he was quiet for a moment. "That's good," he said. "I know," she said. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed his face. It was gone almost immediately, but she'd seen it. She also reorganized his barn tools. That one he noticed and commented on, which was the first time he'd objected to anything she'd done. "I know where everything is," he said, standing in the barn doorway, looking at the rearranged wall rack. "You knew where everything was," she corrected. "Now everything is where it makes sense to be. You'll find it faster. I found it fine before." "Ethan." The shoeing hammer was next to the grain scoops. A pause. "I knew where it was." "You'll know where it is faster now," she said. "Try it for a week. If you hate it, I'll put it back." He looked at the wall for another moment. Then he turned and walked back out to the horses without another word. He didn't ask her to put it back. It was on a Tuesday evening the fourth week that she found the photographs. She hadn't been snooping. She'd been reorganizing the small shelf above the fireplace, straightening books, clearing dust, and the photographs had been tucked behind a collection of survey maps. Two of them pressed between sheets of brown paper like something put away rather than displayed. She didn't open them on purpose. The paper slipped. She caught it by instinct, and the photographs came with it. A woman, young, pretty in a delicate way, dark-haired and serious-eyed. In one photograph she was standing outside, squinting slightly against sunlight. In the other, she was seated, hands folded, wearing a dark dress. On the back of the second one, in faded pencil, Eleanor. 1879. Abigail stood very still. She turned the photographs over twice. Then she put them carefully back behind the survey maps and went back to making dinner. She said nothing about them that night, or the next night. She filed the name away. Eleanor 1879, and the particular quality of stillness that came with it. The sense that here was the shape of a wound she hadn't known to look for. She was out near the fence line when the riders came. It was the fifth week, a Wednesday. She'd been checking the fence posts along the east pasture, which had been her suggestion. Ethan had mentioned the posts were old, and she'd offered to walk the line and note what needed replacing, which was the kind of job that apparently nobody had gotten to recently because nobody had had the time. She had the time. She didn't mind the walking. She heard the horses before she saw them. Two men coming up the lower trail at a clip, not winding up from the valley road, but cutting across from the east, the direction that didn't lead to Silver Creek. She watched them come. Neither of them had the look of neighbors or ordinary travelers. She stood her ground at the fence line. One of them was wearing a city coat wrong for the terrain and the temperature, and had the kind of careful grooming that came with money. The other was built wide across the chest, with the dead watchful eyes of a man paid to be in certain places when certain things needed doing. The groomed one looked her over. "Ma'am, we're looking for the Walker property." "You found it," she said. "And you are Mrs. Walker," she said. The word came out steadier than she expected, and she noted somewhere in the back of her mind that it didn't feel wrong in her mouth. The man's eyes moved over her once more, then past her toward the cabin on the ridge. "We've come up from Cheyenne. Have some papers to deliver to your husband." "What kind of papers?" "Legal matters, property inquiries." His voice was smooth, the voice of a man accustomed to sounding reasonable while doing unreasonable things. "Nothing to trouble yourself about." Abigail looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the second man, the wide one, the watchful one, and the way his hand rested loosely at his belt. "My husband isn't here right now," she said. "I'll tell him you came." "We'd prefer to wait," the smooth one said. "I'd prefer you didn't," she said. "This is private property. You're welcome to come back tomorrow when he's in." Something shifted in the smooth man's expression. Not threatening exactly, not yet, but the politeness thinning just slightly at the edges. "Ma'am, this is a routine legal matter. The Wyoming Territory Land Office is in Cheyenne," Abigail said, "which is a long way to ride for a routine legal matter. What's your name?" A pause. "Harlan Graves. I'm a legal representative." "Representing whom, Mr. Graves?" The name he said when he said it, When those two syllables came out of his mouth, landed in Abigail's chest, like a stone dropped into still water, and she felt the cold spread outward in rings to her fingertips. Victor Langford. She kept her face completely still. She'd had practice at that. "I'll let my husband know you called," she said. "Good day, Mr. Graves." She turned and walked back toward the cabin without hurrying, because hurrying would tell them something, and she was not going to tell them anything. She heard them behind her. The horses not moving for a moment, the sound of low conversation between the two men, and then hoofbeats heading back down the trail. She didn't run until she was certain she was out of their sight line. Ethan was in the barn when she came through the door at something faster than a walk, and he read her face in 1 second flat. He set down what he was doing. "What happened?" she told him. All of it, the men, the coats, the name. She told it fast and clear, the way she'd learned to give information, when information mattered, without the softening that women were expected to apply to things that frightened them. When she finished, Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Graves," he said. "He works for the land office, or he works for Langford." "I think the second one," she said. "He said land office, but he said Langford's name without being asked, which means he wanted me to know." Ethan looked at her. "He wanted to see how you'd react." "Yes." "And how did you—" "I didn't," she said. Not where he could see. Something passed through Ethan's expression. Then, not admiration exactly, because he wasn't a man who broadcasted things like that, but something that looked like recognition. The look of a person seeing something confirmed that they'd suspected for a while. "He found you faster than you thought he would," Ethan said. "Yes," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. He noticed the hands. He looked at them for half a second, then back at her face, and then he did something she didn't expect. He reached out and put his hand briefly firmly over both of hers, just for a moment, and then took it away. "You've got the copies of those documents," he said. "Hidden, yes." "Good," he said. "Then we've got something to work with." He picked up his hat from the nail. "I'm going to ride down to Silver Creek. There's a man there, federal land surveyor, passes through every few weeks. If he's in town, I want to talk to him before Graves does." He looked at her. "Lock the cabin door tonight." "I know how to lock a door," she said. "I know you do," he said. And he was gone. She stood alone in the barn for a long moment, listening to the sound of his horse heading down the mountain. Outside the barn door, the sun was dropping behind the western ridge, and the air had gone cold and thin, the way it did every evening up here, sudden and final. She'd known Victor would come eventually. She'd told herself she'd be ready. She thought about Ethan's hand over hers, brief and warm and entirely without strategy. She thought about Eleanor, 1879, tucked behind the survey maps. She thought about the way Graves had looked at her on that fence line, like a problem to be managed, a loose thread to be pulled. She walked back to the cabin. She locked the door. She sat down at the table with the hidden ledger copies in front of her, and went through them again, line by line, looking for every piece of evidence she had, counting what she knew against what she suspected, measuring her ground. She was still sitting there when Ethan came back 2 hours later, with news that made the cold in her chest spread all the way to her bones. Graves hadn't ridden back down to Cheyenne. He'd ridden into Silver Creek, and he'd gone straight to the land office. Graves had gone to the land office for a reason, and Ethan knew what that reason was before he'd even finished telling her. "There's a claim filed," he said, sitting down across from her at the table, hat still on the cold from the ride still coming off him in waves. "Old one. Pre-territorial survey, 1881. Someone filed a mineral rights claim on 40 acres of the eastern pasture under a name I've never heard. Means nothing on its own, those old claims get filed and forgotten all the time. But if somebody wanted to use it as a legal lever to get onto this property, to establish a right of access to force a survey." He stopped. "Then Graves just handed Victor exactly what he needs," Abigail said. "A reason to come up that mountain with papers and men and a badge or two behind him," Ethan said. "Yes." She sat with that for a moment. Outside the locked cabin door, the mountain was completely dark now. The kind of dark that had no gradation to it. No ambient city glow, just absolute black and the sound of wind pushing through the pine. "How long do we have?" she asked. Legal process done proper 6 to 8 weeks. Done Langford's way. Ethan pulled off his hat, set it on the table. Maybe 2. 2 weeks. She looked at the ledger copies spread in front of her. 2 weeks to turn what she had, documents, numbers, paper evidence, into something that could stop a man with lawyers and judges, and the kind of money that made both of those things interchangeable. The federal land surveyor, she said. Did you find him? Passed through 3 days ago. Won't be back until the end of the month. That's too late. Probably, he said. He wasn't sugarcoating it. She respected that even now, even with the cold spreading through her chest. There's a federal marshal stationed in Laramie, she said. 2 days' ride. If I could get the documents to him directly. Graves will be watching the trail, Ethan said. He knows you're here. If you try to ride for Laramie in the next few days, you won't make it without being stopped. Then I don't go, she said. I send the documents. With who? She thought. Tom Briggs, she said. She'd met Briggs twice, Ethan's closest neighbor 2 miles east, a quiet man with a wife and 3 daughters, and the kind of steady face that suggested he'd seen hard things and dealt with them honestly. Graves doesn't know him. He's not connected to me or to you in any way Langford's men would know about. Ethan looked at her. You figured that out in about 30 seconds. I've been thinking about contingencies since March, she said. Tom Briggs, first thing tomorrow morning before Graves has time to set a watch on the Eastern Trail. Ethan was quiet for a moment. I'll ride over tonight. Warn him. Give him the choice. It's dark. I know this mountain in the dark, he said simply. He stood. Took his hat. She stood too, and reached past him to the shelf where she kept the hidden packet, the originals she'd protected since Ohio, the copies she'd made in 3 separate hands to make them harder to dismiss. She selected the copies, the right ones, the ones that showed Victor's fraudulent land transfers and the forged debt instrument most clearly, and she folded them with the practice of someone who had done this many times and handed them to Ethan. I took them. Looked at her. If something goes wrong, she said, something's not going to go wrong. Ethan. She held his gaze. If something goes wrong, if Graves moves faster than we think, if Victor gets here before Briggs reaches Laramie, promise me you won't do anything that cost you this land, this ranch. You've built this for 20 years. I won't be the reason you lose it. Something moved in his expression that she couldn't fully read. Something that went deeper than the usual careful stillness he kept between himself and the world. You're not the reason for any of this, he said. Langford is. Promise me anyway. A long pause. I'll promise you this, he said. I've got no intention of losing this land or anything else on it. He looked at her for one more moment. A look she felt more than she could describe, something direct and deliberate, and entirely without the hedging or performance she'd associated with men who looked at her, and then he went out into the dark. She sat back down. She left the lamp on. She didn't sleep. He came back 3 hours later. Briggs had said yes. He'd leave before dawn with the documents sewn into the lining of his saddlebag, taking the north trail around the long way, the way Graves wouldn't be watching. She let out a breath she'd been holding for hours. Good man, she said. Best neighbor I've ever had, Ethan said. He sat down, poured himself coffee from the pot she'd kept warm, and drank half of it before he said the next thing. He also told me something. She looked up. Graves was in the saloon tonight, talking to Dobbins. The name landed unpleasantly. Dobbins. Dobbins knows everyone's business in this county, Ethan said. He drinks with the men from the land office. He's the kind of person Graves would pay for information, what the mountain looks like, how many people on it, whether there are other approaches. He set down his cup. He also said your name apparently. Told Graves you'd stood down half the town your first day here. Graves found that interesting. Interesting how? Couldn't tell, Ethan said. But Dobbins describing you to a man like Graves makes me want to know what else Dobbins knows. She thought about it. He can tell Graves about the trails, about the cabin's position, about you and your history here. She paused. He can't tell him anything about the documents because he doesn't know about the documents. Nobody in Silver Creek knows about them. Except Ruth, Ethan said. She looked at him. What? At the eating place. The morning you arrived. He didn't look away. I told Ruth your name, and that you'd be coming. I told her you were carrying documents from Ohio that were important. I told her because if something had happened to you on the trail, I wanted someone in town who'd know to look for them. He said it plainly without apology. I should have told you that before now. She sat very still. Does Ruth talk? Not in 30 years has she ever repeated a word I've said to her, he said. But you should know. She thought about Ruth, the woman who'd brought coffee without being asked, who'd looked at neither of them in any way that suggested curiosity or judgment. She's trustworthy, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Then it's fine. She let out a slow breath. It's fine. She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them threw uneven light, and in it, Ethan Walker looked both older and younger than she'd thought him. Older in the lines around his eyes. Younger in the way he was looking at her, which didn't have the guarded distance she'd gotten used to in those first weeks. Something had shifted over the past month. She'd felt it without being able to name it until now. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes, Eleanor. She said it quietly, carefully watching his face. Everything in him went still. Not defensive still. The way a man goes still when he reaches a place inside himself that he hasn't visited in a while and finds it has not changed. You saw the photographs, he said, not an accusation. They fell. I put them back. I'm sorry. Don't be. He looked at the table. Eleanor was my wife, married in 1878. She died in the winter of 1880, fever. A pause. She was the reason I came up this mountain to begin with. She loved it here. When she was gone, I couldn't think of a reason to come down. Abigail said nothing. She knew better than to fill this silence with comfort. He didn't need comfort. He needed the space to say it. When I put that advertisement in the paper, he said, I told myself it was practical. The ranch needs a second pair of hands. I'm not getting younger. All of that. He looked up. That was true. It was also a way to want something again, without calling it wanting. She felt the weight of that land in her chest. I know what that's like, she said. Thomas, he said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. He was a good man. He didn't deserve what Victor did to his memory, using his death as a business transaction. Something tightened in her jaw. I came west partly to get away from Victor's reach, but I also came because staying in Ohio meant watching every piece of Thomas's life get picked apart and rewritten by a man who was his exact opposite. I couldn't stand there and watch that. Ethan was looking at her with that complete still attention. You're trying to protect what's his, he said. Yes. And I'm trying to protect what's mine, he said. Seems like we want the same thing. It was such a plain statement. No poetry in it. No reaching for significance. Just a man looking across a table at a woman in the lamplight and saying a true thing. She didn't know what to say back. So she just held his gaze and let the truth of it sit there between them, taking up space, and found that for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she needed to have an answer ready. The knock came at dawn. Not a polite knock. A flat-palmed strike against the cabin door, the kind that belongs to official business or trouble, and both of them were on their feet before the sound finished echoing. Ethan was at the door first. He opened it. Two men. Not Graves, different men. Local men, she could tell by the boots. One of them was wearing a deputy's badge that caught the early light. The other was Dobbins. Abigail felt her stomach drop. Walker, the deputy said. He was young, uncomfortable doing a job he'd been told to do. Got papers here from the Territorial Land Office. Survey dispute eastern parcel. Says we need access to the property to establish the boundary line. Today, Ethan said. Today. She was already standing behind Ethan's shoulder close enough that she could see the paper the deputy was holding. Legal language, official stamp. The kind of document that was designed to look unassailable while doing something quietly wrong. That claim was filed in 1881, she said. Both men looked at her. Let me see the filing date. The deputy blinked. Ma'am. The filing date, she said. On the claim document that authorizes this survey. I'd like to see it. He looked at Dobbins. Dobbins's face had gone through several complicated expressions and settled on something between satisfaction and unease. Ethan put out his hand. The deputy, after a moment, handed over the papers. Ethan looked at them, passed them to Abigail. She read fast. Her eyes found what she was looking for in the second paragraph. Her jaw set. This claim was filed 9 days ago, she said. Not 1881. 9 days ago, in the name of a company called Consolidated Western Holdings. She looked up at the deputy. Do you know who owns that company? He didn't answer. Victor Langford, she said. Out of Columbus, Ohio. The same man who forged a debt instrument against my late husband's estate and has been attempting to use fraudulent legal filings to pursue me across 3 territories. She held up the document. This survey order was generated from a false claim. The claim is 9 days old. Any access to this property based on it is improper. The young deputy looked genuinely uncertain now. Whatever he'd expected this morning, it wasn't a woman in a cabin doorway citing the filing dates on his legal papers at him. Dobbins stepped forward. Walker, your wife doesn't get to... She just did, Ethan said. His voice was very quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't need volume. Dobbins went silent. Deputy, Abigail said, keeping her voice level and professional. I'm going to ask you to ride back to Silver Creek and tell whoever gave you those papers that we'll be happy to accommodate a survey once the underlying claim has been verified by a federal land examiner. That's within our legal rights. She looked at him directly. You know it is. He did. She could see it in his face, the uncomfortable knowledge of a young man who'd been handed bad paperwork and was starting to understand it. I'll need to report back, he said. Of course, she said. Thank you for coming in person. That was proper procedure. She was giving him a way out with his dignity intact, and he took it. He touched his hat, turned his horse, and started back down the trail. Dobbins didn't move immediately. He stood there looking at her with something that had curdled from amusement into something uglier. You think you're smart, he said. I think I know what a filing date means, she said. Have a good morning, Mr. Dobbins. He looked at Ethan, then back at her. Then he turned and followed the deputy down the trail. She waited until both horses were out of earshot. Then she turned and walked back inside the cabin, sat down at the table, and pressed her hands flat against the wood, the way she had that first morning in Silver Creek, to stop them shaking. It didn't work as well this time. Ethan came in behind her. He didn't sit. He stood near the door watching her, and she could feel the weight of his attention, even with her back to him. That was impressive, he said. That was the opening move, she said. Victor sent the deputy to test us, to see if we'd roll over, invite a survey team, and let them establish a foothold on the eastern pasture. She turned around. We didn't. So now he knows we'll fight. Which means the next move will be harder. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. How much harder? She thought about Victor Langford, the careful, patient intelligence behind everything he'd done in Columbus, the way he'd moved pieces for months before she'd even understood a game was being played. The way he'd smiled at her at Thomas's funeral and told her not to worry about the business details, he'd handle everything, as if she were a piece of furniture he was planning to relocate at his convenience. He'll come himself, she said. Victor doesn't send men to do things he wants done completely. He comes personally with lawyers and witnesses and a version of events so polished and reasonable sounding that anyone who doesn't know the truth will believe it. She held Ethan's gaze. He'll be here within the week. I'm certain of it. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when two people look at each other across a room and understand without negotiating it that a line has just been drawn. Then we've got a week, Ethan said. We've got a week, she agreed. He nodded once, slow and decided. I'll ride to the Henderson place and the Morrison spread this afternoon. Warn them. Langford tries to move on my eastern pasture. It's one step from their northern boundaries. He picked up his hat. People in this territory have long memories about land. She stood. I'm coming with you. He looked at her steadily the way he always did, without the automatic dismissal she'd expected and braced for. All right, he said. They rode out together in the cold morning air, the mountain rising above them and the valley spreading wide below, and Abigail Harper looked at the trail ahead and felt underneath the fear. underneath the calculation and the careful management of what she knew against what she didn't. Something that had been absent from her life for so long she almost didn't recognize it. She wasn't running anymore. She was standing on a piece of ground that mattered to her beside a man who hadn't once told her what she was or wasn't capable of, and she was riding toward a fight she intended completely and without reservation to win. 2 miles down the trail. Ethan's horse broke stride. He pulled up sharply. She pulled up beside him. There at the junction where the eastern trail met the main valley road sat 3 riders, waiting. Still as fence posts in the early light, and at the center on a tall gray horse, wearing a city coat and a composed expression that belonged in a courthouse rather than a mountain trail, was a man she hadn't seen in 8 months but would have recognized anywhere. Victor Langford had not waited a week. He was already here. Victor Langford smiled the way he always smiled with his mouth, only the smile of a man who had practiced it in front of mirrors until it looked like something genuine. "Abigail," he said. "My God, you look well." She didn't answer. She sat on Clara with her hands steady on the reins and her heart going at twice its normal rate, and looked at him the way you look at something dangerous that you have been expecting and are still not entirely prepared for. How was exactly as she remembered. 52 years old, lean in the way that expensive tailors could manufacture, even when nature didn't cooperate. Silver at the temples, dressed entirely wrong for a Wyoming mountain trail in September. The gray horse beneath him was too fine for this terrain. Everything about Victor Langford was too fine for whatever room he was standing in, and he knew it, and he used it. The 2 men flanking him were not Graves and his companion from before. These were different men, bigger, quieter, the kind of hired stillness that costs money. "Mr. Langford," she said. Her voice came out level. She was grateful for that. "I've been looking for you for quite some time," he said pleasantly, as if this were a social call, as if 8 months of her running and hiding and sleeping in relay stations had been an inconvenience to him rather than the survival strategy it had been. "You left Columbus without saying goodbye. That was unkind." "I left Columbus because you were attempting to have me declared incompetent," she said. That seemed like a reasonable response. His smile didn't change. "There was a concern about your mental state following Thomas's death. A number of people shared that concern. I was trying to protect you." "From what?" "From yourself, my dear. From decisions made in grief." The words landed exactly as they were designed to smooth reasonable, the kind of thing that sounds caring in a courthouse when a judge is listening. She'd heard him use that voice before. She'd watched it work. Ethan had not spoken. He sat on his horse to her left, completely still, watching Victor Langford with the focused, unhurried attention of a man who has identified exactly what he is dealing with and is in no rush to deal with it carelessly. Victor looked at him for the first time. "You must be Mr. Walker." "I am," Ethan said. "I want you to know I have no quarrel with you," Victor said. "My business is with Mrs. Harper with Abigail. This is a family matter. A matter of an estate debts owed, and a woman who left Ohio before we could settle things properly." He paused. "I have documents from the territorial court in Cheyenne authorizing a conversation with Abigail regarding her late husband's financial obligations. That's all this is." "Let me see them," Abigail said. Victor reached into his coat and produced a folded document. She rode Clara forward 2 steps close enough to take it. Not close enough to be grabbed. Not close enough to let the wide-shouldered men on either side of him get comfortable, and took it from his hand. She read it. It was well done. She had to give him that. On the surface it looked legitimate, a territorial court seal, a judge's signature language about estate reconciliation and outstanding debt verification. If you didn't know what you were looking for, if you hadn't spent 6 years keeping books and learning the difference between a legitimate instrument and one constructed to look like it, you might have believed it. She folded it back along its original crease. "Judge Harmon signed this," she said. "He did," Victor said. "Judge Harmon received $17,000 from your associate Gerald Price in February of 1886, she said. "I have the ledger entry. I have the corresponding bank transfer record and a letter in Price's hand confirming the purpose of the payment." She looked up from the document. "This authorization is worthless." Something moved in Victor's expression. Not much, he was too controlled for much, but enough. The smile went fractionally thinner. "You've been a busy woman," he said. "I've been a thorough one," she said. "There's a difference." The first of his flanking men shifted in his saddle. Not dramatically, just the small loaded movement of someone preparing for a change in the situation's direction. She noticed it. Ethan noticed it too. She felt rather than saw him adjust his weight. "Abigail." Victor's voice dropped into something quieter, more personal, the register he used when the public performance wasn't working, and he wanted to remind you that he was capable of other approaches. "You are carrying documents that do not belong to you. They were taken from a private business during a period of grief and mental instability. Any court in this territory any court that hasn't been paid will look at what those documents actually say," she said. "And what they say is that you transferred $412,000 of Thomas Harper's company funds into a holding company you owned under a different name over a period of 3 years. Thomas didn't know. I didn't know until after he died, and I started reading the books myself." Her voice was steady. She'd said this out loud in her head so many times that saying it in the open air felt almost ordinary. "You didn't steal from a dead man's estate, Victor. You stole while he was alive and trusting you, and then you used his death as an opportunity to take whatever was left and bury the evidence under an incompetency filing. That's not a debt collection, that's fraud, and it's been fraud since 1883. The silence on that mountain trail was total. Victor looked at her for a long moment. The smile was completely gone now. "Where are the documents?" he said quietly. "Somewhere you won't find them," she said. "Abigail." "They're already gone," she said. "They left this mountain 2 days ago. By the time you ride back to Silver Creek and try to stop whatever you think you can stop, they'll be in Laramie, in federal hands." She held his gaze. "It's over, Victor." He sat very still. Then he said, "Graves." She hadn't seen Graves arrive. He'd come up behind them on the trail. She didn't know how long he'd been there, whether he'd circled around, whether this had been the plan from the beginning, and now he was positioned at their backs, blocking the trail back up to the cabin. She understood it in half a second. Victor in front, Graves behind. 3 armed men, total 4, including whoever Graves had with him, and herself and Ethan unarmed, except for the revolvers they both carried on their hips, outnumbered, and on a narrow trail with no clean exits. She felt Ethan go completely deliberately still beside her. Victor spread his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. "I don't want anyone to be hurt," he said. "I want the documents. Give them to me, and I'll ride back to Cheyenne and file that the matter is settled. You can stay on your mountain, marry your cowboy, live whatever life you want to live. I'll leave you alone." She looked at him. "You'll leave me alone," she said. "You have my word." She almost laughed. She didn't, because this wasn't the moment for it, but it was a near thing. "Your word," she said. "The word of a man who forged a dead man's debts, bought a territorial judge, and rode 3 days into Wyoming to trap a woman on a mountain trail." She shook her head. "Victor, I have never in my life made a worse investment than trusting your word." His expression hardened. "You're making a mistake." "I've made several," she said. "This isn't one of them." What happened next happened fast. Not with guns, not yet. But Graves's horse lurched forward on the trail behind them, closing the gap deliberately, and the wide man on Victor's right knee shifted his mount sideways to crowd Clara's flank, and in the space of about 3 seconds, the geometry of the trail changed from tense standoff to something that felt like being squeezed. Clara didn't like being crowded. She sidestepped hard, and Abigail kept her seat through pure reflex. Weeks of falling off and getting back on had produced something in her muscles that her brain wasn't involved in. And in that same moment, Ethan's voice came sharp and clear across the trail. "Stop right there." Not loud, not performing. Just the specific flat certainty of a man who means exactly what he says. The wide man's horse stopped, and then, from further up the trail from above, from the direction of the cabin, came the sound of horses. Multiple horses, coming down at a clip. Victor turned. Tom Briggs came around the bend. First, which was wrong. Briggs should have been 2 days down the road toward Laramie. Behind him came a man she didn't recognize, and then 2 more, and then a face she did recognize. Ruth from the eating place, seated on a horse she clearly knew how to handle. And beside her, the postmaster from Silver Creek, who was apparently more capable of outrage than his mild demeanor had suggested. And behind all of them, wearing the expression of a man who had ridden hard for several hours and was not in a generous mood, was a badge. Federal, not territorial. The star-shaped kind that came from Laramie. She stared. Briggs pulled up beside her. "Didn't get far," he said. "Ran into Marshal Cade on the Laramie Road 3 hours south. He was already heading up here. Got a telegraph from someone in Columbus 2 days ago." He paused. Someone name of Gerald Price. She heard the name and felt the world tilt under her slightly. Price. Victor's own associate. The man who'd written the letter confirming the payment to Judge Harmon. "Price contacted the federal marshal's office," she said. "Seems he decided being a witness for the government was preferable to whatever Victor was planning to do with him when this was finished," Briggs said. He glanced at Victor, who had gone the color of old ash. Price gave them everything. Signed statement. Document copies from his own files. Marshal Cade rode forward. He was a large, unhurried man who looked at Victor Langford with the professional disinterest of someone who had dealt with many men who thought their money made them untouchable and had been corrected on that point. "Victor Langford," he said, "I have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of wire fraud, document forgery, and unlawful financial transfer across state and territorial lines." He looked at the two flanking men. "I'd advise your associates to think carefully about the next few minutes." Victor said nothing. The color had not come back to his face. He looked for the first time in her experience of him like a man who had run every calculation available and found that they all came out wrong. He looked at Abigail. "You planned this," he said. Not angry, stunned beneath the control the way a man sounds when he has fundamentally misjudged someone and is only now understanding the scale of it. "No," she said. "Price planned this. I just kept the records so it would mean something when he did." She held his gaze. "You spent 3 years assuming I was Thomas's bookkeeper because he was kind enough to include me. You never once considered that I was good at it." Cade's deputies moved forward. Victor Langford, who had arrived on a mountain trail in Wyoming territory, with 3 armed men and a fraudulent court document, and every expectation of walking away with what he wanted, did not resist. He was too intelligent for that, and whatever else he had always understood when a position was lost. They took him down the mountain. Graves. When Cade's deputy turned to him, looked at the marshal and looked at Victor's retreating back, and made the calculation that men like Graves generally make in these moments. He told them everything he'd been paid to do, and everyone he'd reported to before Cade had finished asking. The wide man said nothing. He didn't need to. He'd done nothing technically illegal that morning, and everyone knew it, and he rode away down the valley road with the specific speed of a man whose employer has just been arrested and whose paycheck is therefore a historical document. The trail emptied out. Abigail sat on Clara in the sudden enormous quiet and felt the tension go out of her body all at once, the way it does when something you've been holding for a very long time is finally set down. Her hands were shaking again. She let them. Ruth pulled her horse alongside. "You all right?" "Yes," Abigail said. "How did you know to come?" "Ethan sent a boy down to the postmaster last night with a note," Ruth said. "Case things went sideways this morning. Postmaster sent up to Briggs. Briggs ran into the marshal." She shrugged. "Mountain Telegraph." Abigail looked at Ethan. I was watching her with that steady, unhurried attention. His expression was doing several things at once, which for Ethan Walker was the equivalent of high drama. "You sent a contingency note," she said. "Last night," he said, "while you were going through the ledgers. You didn't tell me." "You had enough to think about," he said. "And you'd already built the plan. I just built a floor under it." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her chest was doing something she hadn't quite authorized. Something warm and unsteady and real, in a way that she hadn't felt in a very long time. The kind of feeling that doesn't announce itself, but simply arrives and stands there and waits for you to notice it. "That was well done," she said. "So was what you said to him on that trail," Ethan said. "Every word of it." Ruth looked between them and had the good sense not to comment. Tom Briggs was already turning back toward his spread, tipping his hat. The postmaster was doing the same, looking satisfied in the way of a man who has done something decent and knows it. One by one, the mountain people who had come down that trail dispersed back to their own lives, their own land, their own particular brand of hard, quiet work. And Abigail Harper sat on a steady horse on a Wyoming mountain trail in the September light, with the evidence safe, and the man who'd haunted 8 months of her life riding toward a federal jail, and she breathed in the cold, clear air and thought about what came next. Not running, not hiding, not calculating exits and contingencies in the back of her mind while trying to appear calm. Just next. Whatever that meant. Whatever it looked like when the danger passed and left the actual life behind. She looked up the trail toward the cabin on the ridge. "We should get back," she said. "I burned the breakfast this morning when that deputy knocked. There's still oatmeal in the pot if it hasn't stuck completely." Ethan looked at her. That beginning of a smile moved across his face again, the one she'd been collecting like evidence. "It's stuck completely," he said. "Then I'll make more," she said. They rode back up the mountain together, and for the first time since she'd stepped off a stagecoach in Silver Creek, with her heart in her throat and a town full of strangers laughing at her back. Abigail Harper felt the solid particular weight of a thing that was hers ground. She had earned a life, she had chosen a man riding quietly beside her, who had never once, not once, told her what she couldn't do. The cabin came into view above them. She kept riding toward it. The oatmeal had stuck completely. She scraped the pot anyway, made a fresh batch, and stood at the stove in the cabin kitchen, while the morning light came through the window, and the mountain settled back into its ordinary silence around her. Her hands had stopped shaking by the time the water boiled. That was something. Ethan came in from the barn, where he'd been checking the horses after the ride, and sat down at the table without ceremony. She set the bowl in front of him. He picked up the spoon. They ate in the quiet that had become over the past weeks one of her favorite things about this life. Not empty silence, not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the particular full silence of two people who are comfortable enough in each other's company to not need to fill the air. It lasted about 4 minutes. "Price," Ethan said. "I know," she said. "You didn't expect that." "No," she admitted. "I knew Price was scared of Victor. I knew he'd seen enough to have leverage if he wanted it. I didn't know he'd use it." She turned her bowl in her hands. Victor must have done something to frighten him badly enough that turning federal witness seemed like the safer option. "Men like Langford tend to eventually do that," Ethan said. "They get so confident in their own position that they stop being careful with the people underneath them." She thought about that. Thomas used to say that every dishonest man eventually becomes his own worst enemy. He just needs enough time and enough success. Ethan looked at her. "Thomas sounds like he was a wise man." "How was," she said. "He was also the kind of man who trusted people too much, which is partly why Victor was able to do what he did for 3 years without Thomas seeing it." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know whether to be grateful I kept those books or angry that I didn't see it sooner." "You saw it," Ethan said, "when it mattered." She looked at him across the table. He said things like that with such complete plainness, no decoration, no attempt to comfort or manage, just the clean statement of what he observed to be true. She had learned over the past weeks that this was the most trustworthy kind of honesty. Not the kind that was kind on purpose, the kind that simply was. "The marshal will need my testimony," she said. "In Laramie. Probably Cheyenne as well once the federal case moves forward." "I'll ride with you," he said. "You don't have to." He looked at her with that expression that she'd come to understand meant the conversation was settled, and he saw no reason to argue it. "I know I don't have to," he said. "I'll ride with you." The federal case moved faster than she'd expected. Marshal Cade, it turned out, had been building a file on Victor Langford's territorial activities for 8 months, the mineral rights dealings. Ethan had mentioned a fraudulent land sale in Colorado, a banking irregularity in Kansas. Abigail's documents didn't just support the case against Victor, they were the keystone of it. $412,000, 3 years of ledger entries. Price's signed statement. Judge Harmon's purchased signature, When it was laid out in federal court in Laramie, on a cold October morning, the prosecutor said it was the most comprehensively documented fraud case he'd handled in 14 years. She sat in that courtroom in a dress she'd made herself over 2 evenings the week before, dark green wool practical cut. Nothing that required someone else's help to put on or take off, and she gave her testimony in a clear, even voice, and did not look at Victor once. She didn't need to. She'd looked at him enough on that mountain trail. She'd said what needed saying then. What happened in this room was just the formal record catching up to the truth. Victor was convicted on 7 counts. His assets, the legitimate ones, the ones that hadn't already been moved or hidden, were seized. The fraudulent debt against Thomas Harper's estate was voided. The company Victor had spent 3 years quietly dismantling was declared insolvent due to his own fraud, which meant Abigail received a settlement from the federal recovery that was not a fortune, but was enough. Enough to matter. Enough to mean something. She was standing outside the courthouse afterward, the October wind coming hard off the Laramie plains, when Ethan put his coat around her shoulders without asking. She looked at him. "You were watching the prosecutor when he read the verdict," she said. "Not the judge." "The prosecutor had the better reaction," he said. She laughed. It came out surprised, genuine, the kind of laugh that doesn't plan itself. He looked at her when she did it, looked at her like he was committing something to memory. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just you don't laugh as much as you should." She looked at him for a moment. "I haven't had as much to laugh about as I should," she said. "Lately that's changing." They rode back to the mountain the next day. 2 days in Laramie. 2 days of courthouse corridors and formal language, and the grinding procedural machinery of federal justice, and then the trail back up through the valley and onto the mountain path she had come to know so well she could ride it in the dark. She'd done exactly that once. On a night when Ethan had been in Silver Creek, and she'd heard something at the tree line and gone out to check it herself, because waiting was not something she'd ever been good at. She thought about the woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach 3 months ago. The one with shaking hands and a practiced steady voice, and 8 months of running folded up behind her eyes like a map of somewhere she never wanted to go back to. She didn't feel like that woman anymore. Not entirely. The fear was still there in some form. She suspected it always would be, that it had become structural part of the way she moved through the world, but it had a different character now. Not the fear of being caught. The fear of losing something you'd built. That was a different thing entirely. That was a fear worth having. The cabin came into view, and she felt the same thing she'd felt every time she rode up that last stretch, through all the weeks of failing and learning and earning this mountain by small increments. The specific deep satisfaction of arriving somewhere that was hers. She was inside hanging her coat on the peg by the door when Ethan said her name. She turned. I was standing in the middle of the room with something in his hands. A small flat box, the kind a jeweler used, which was so entirely unlike anything she associated with Ethan Walker that for a moment she just looked at it. "I was in Laramie," he said. "Had a few hours while the court was in recess yesterday afternoon." She crossed the room. He opened the box. It was simple. Gold band, no stones, no fussiness. The kind of ring that would stand up to work and weather and 20 Wyoming winters. She looked at it for a moment, then looked at him. "We're already married," she said. "By law," he said. "On paper. The arrangement we came to." He held the box steady. "This is something else. This is me asking. Properly. Not a letter in a newspaper. Not a practical arrangement. Me asking." She looked at his face. That careful, private face that she'd been reading like a language for 3 months, learning the difference between his silences, understanding what it cost him to say things out loud when his whole character ran toward the wordless. "You're asking," she said. "I'm asking," he said. "If you want to stay. Not because it's useful, and not because you don't have anywhere else to go. You've got settlement money. Now you've got options. I know that. I'm asking because—" He stopped, set his jaw, tried again. "Because this cabin is different with you in it. Because I come home differently than I used to. Because when you were on that trail this morning facing Langford, He stopped again. "You were scared," she said quietly. "I was," he said. "And I don't scare easy." She reached out and took the ring from the box and held it in her palm, feeling the weight of it, the clean, simple honesty of it. "I want to stay," she said. "Not because I don't have options, because this is the option I want." She looked up at him. "And because you are the first man in my life who has ever looked at me and seen what's actually there instead of what he expected to find. That's not a small thing, Ethan. That's not a thing I'm going to walk away from." He took the ring from her palm and put it on her finger, and his hands were very steady and very careful in the way she'd learned they always were. The way they'd been that first day, when he'd found her wrist after her fall and checked the bone with complete focus. She looked at the ring on her hand for a moment. "Simple," she said. "Yes," he said. "That suits you." "Perfectly," she said. The wedding, the real one, the one that Silver Creek would remember, happened in November, 6 weeks later on a Saturday that had no particular significance except that the weather was clear, and Tom Briggs's wife had organized a gathering that had somehow expanded from a small neighborhood affair into the better part of the county. She hadn't asked for it. She wasn't sure Ethan had either. But Ruth had been involved from the planning stages, and when Ruth was involved, things tended to happen at a scale beyond what was originally intended. The church that had been losing its argument with gravity turned out under the circumstances to be perfectly adequate. The pews were full. People she knew, Briggs and his wife and daughters, the postmaster, the Hendersons and Morrisons from the neighboring spreads, and people she was still learning faces from down in the valley, who'd heard the story of Victor Langford's arrest, and apparently felt that the woman involved deserved a decent wedding reception as a form of communal apology for how she'd been received 3 months earlier. Dobbins was not there. Nobody mentioned Dobbins. She stood at the front of that church in her dark green wool dress. Same one because it was the best she had, and it fit her properly, and she refused to be apologetic about either of those facts, and looked at Ethan Walker, who had traded his usual work clothes for a clean dark jacket, and was managing it with the dignified discomfort of a man who knew this was required and had made his peace with it. He looked at her when she walked in. He looked at her the whole way down the aisle. Not with the performative attention of a man making a point, but with the specific private focus she recognized as simply the way he looked at things he found genuinely significant. The minister was brief, which she appreciated. The vows were simple, which she appreciated more. When the minister asked if anyone had words, the room was quiet for a moment, and then Ethan cleared his throat. People looked at him. He was not by any measure a man who sought crowds or made speeches. The room understood this and waited with a particular gentle attention. "I put an advertisement in a newspaper," he said, "because the ranch needed help, and I needed something I didn't know how to name." He looked at his hands for a second, then back at her. "What I got was a woman who showed up to a town that laughed at her and made that town quiet in about 30 seconds. A small sound moved through the room. Recognition, amusement, something warmer than both. "She reorganized my barn. She argued with me about it. She was right." More sound, clearer now. "She carried evidence 3,000 miles to protect a dead man's name and her own integrity against someone with more money and lawyers than any one person should have." His voice was steady, but she could see in his face what it was costing him to say things out loud in a room full of people. "I thought I was giving a wife a home," he said. "What I didn't understand was that she was the one giving it back to me." The room was entirely still. She felt the tears come and let them, because she was done managing herself for other people's comfort. Done being contained and practical and steady for the benefit of an audience. These were